Carl Jung did not write the Red Book to teach. He wrote it because he was afraid of what might happen if he did not. In the years following his break with Sigmund Freud, Jung found himself standing at the edge of an inner collapse. His professional identity was unraveling, his friendships were severed, and the theoretical foundation he had helped build suddenly felt hollow. What followed was not a calm period of reflection, but a descent, deliberate, terrifying, and transformative, into the depths of his own unconscious. The Red Book is the record of that descent. It is not a psychology textbook. It is a confession, a dialogue with the soul, and a map drawn by a man who chose to face the chaos within rather than be destroyed by it. Jung believed that modern humanity had lost its connection to the inner world. Science, rationality, and material progress had sharpened the intellect, but starved the soul. People no longer listened to their dreams, their myths, or their inner images. They dismissed them as fantasy, pathology, or superstition. Jung felt this loss personally. As his outer life grew successful, his inner life grew silent, and that silence terrified him more than madness. He began to experience powerful visions, waking dreams, and emotional storms that felt autonomous, as if something inside him demanded attention. Instead of suppressing them, Jung made a radical decision. He would confront them directly. He would let the unconscious speak. This decision led him into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. Every day, Jung would enter a meditative state and allow images, characters, and landscapes to arise freely in his mind. He did not control them. He did not analyze them at first. He experienced them as real encounters. Figures spoke to him. Gods appeared. Dead prophets walked beside him. He recorded these experiences in notebooks, which later became the illuminated manuscript known as the Red Book. What makes this work unsettling is not its symbolism, but its sincerity. Jung was not pretending. He believed these inner figures possessed psychological reality and carried truths modern people had forgotten. At the heart of these visions is Jung's encounter with his own soul. Early in the narrative, Jung realizes that the soul is not a passive possession, but an independent presence, one that can be neglected, offended, or silenced. He addresses the soul directly, acknowledging that his devotion to intellect, reputation, and science had caused him to abandon it. This admission marks a turning point. Jung begins to understand that meaning does not come from conquering the world, but from reconciling with the inner voice that modern life teaches us to ignore. The soul, in Jung's vision, is not gentle. It is demanding, paradoxical, and often cruel in its honesty. One of the most disturbing realizations Jung records is that goodness alone is incomplete. He confronts the idea that striving to be purely moral, rational, and enlightened creates a shadow. Everything rejected, denied, and pushed into darkness. This shadow does not disappear. It grows stronger. Jung begins to see that evil is not merely something external to be fought, but something internal to be acknowledged. This does not mean acting out destructive impulses, but recognizing their existence. Without this recognition, the shadow takes control unconsciously. Jung's descent teaches him that wholeness requires holding opposites together, light and dark, reason and madness, faith and doubt. As Jung continues deeper, he encounters archetypal figures that represent universal patterns of the human psyche. These are not personal memories, but timeless images shared across cultures and eras. He meets figures resembling prophets, warriors, wise old men, and tricksters. Each challenges his assumptions. One tells him that knowledge without humility leads to arrogance. Another reveals that truth cannot be owned, only lived. Through these dialogues, Jung begins to understand that myths are not primitive lies, but psychological truths expressed in symbolic language. Modern humans, he realizes, have not outgrown myth. They have merely forgotten how to read it. A recurring theme in the Red Book is sacrifice. Jung learns that transformation demands the death of old identities. The self that clings to certainty, social approval, and intellectual superiority must be relinquished. This is not symbolic comfort. It is painful loss. Jung grieves the man he used to be. He mourns the security of belonging to established ideas. Yet the visions insist that clinging to the old self prevents growth. True renewal requires stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. This process feels like madness because it dissolves familiar structures, but Jung insists that refusing this descent leads to a far greater danger: spiritual emptiness. What makes Jung's journey extraordinary is that he does not escape into fantasy. He constantly returns to ordinary life, his family, his work, his patience. He insists that the inner world must not replace reality, but enrich it. The goal is not to live in visions, but to integrate their meaning. This balance between inner chaos and outer responsibility becomes a central lesson. Jung warns that immersion in the unconscious without grounding can destroy a person. The Red Book is therefore not an invitation to abandon reason, but a call to expand it. By the end of this first phase of the journey, Jung reaches a sobering realization. The modern world is spiritually ill, not because it lacks intelligence, but because it lacks meaning. People chase success, certainty, and progress while avoiding the inner questions that give life depth. Jung's descent reveals that meaning is not found. It is created through dialogue with the unconscious. This dialogue is uncomfortable, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Yet without it, the soul withers. The Red Book begins as a personal crisis, but it quietly unfolds into a universal warning. When humanity abandons its inner life, it risks losing its humanity altogether. As Jung's descent continues, the inner world grows less chaotic but more demanding. The figures he encounters no longer merely shock him, they begin to instruct him. Jung realizes that the unconscious is not random madness, but an organized realm governed by its own laws. These laws do not obey logic in the modern sense, yet they possess a profound psychological order. The images that arise are symbolic, not literal, and Jung slowly learns that meaning is hidden not in explanation, but in experience. To understand the unconscious, one must endure it, not dominate it. One of the most important lessons Jung receives is the danger of identification with inner figures. When powerful archetypes appear, there is a temptation to believe oneself chosen, enlightened, or superior. Jung confronts this temptation directly. He recognizes that inflation, the ego mistaking itself for something divine, is one of the greatest psychological dangers. The unconscious can elevate a person or destroy them, depending on whether humility is maintained. Jung repeatedly reminds himself that he is not a prophet or a god, but a man engaging with symbolic realities. This distinction becomes crucial for survival. Through his visions, Jung encounters the idea that truth is multiple and contradictory. The psyche does not offer a single path or absolute doctrine. Instead, it presents paradox after paradox. Jung is forced to accept that life cannot be reduced to moral simplicity. Strength contains weakness. Wisdom contains folly. Faith contains doubt. He learns that psychological health does not mean eliminating contradictions, but holding them consciously. This ability to live with tension becomes one of the central achievements of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated self. Jung's dialogue with inner figures often turns confrontational. They challenge his scientific pride, his desire for control, and his fear of humiliation. One voice accuses him of valuing knowledge over life, of collecting ideas instead of living them. This accusation strikes deeply. Jung begins to understand that modern humans often replace direct experience with concepts, using theories as shields against vulnerability. The unconscious demands something different. It demands participation, emotional risk, and honesty. Jung realizes that wisdom cannot be accumulated like information. It must be embodied through suffering and transformation. Another recurring theme is the rediscovery of the feminine principle within the psyche, which Jung later conceptualizes as the anima. This inner feminine voice represents feeling, relatedness, intuition, and depth. Jung recognizes that his overdeveloped rationality had silenced this aspect of himself. In his visions, the anima appears both seductive and terrifying, guiding and deceiving, nurturing and destructive. Jung learns that ignoring this inner presence leads to emotional sterility, while surrendering to it without consciousness leads to chaos. Integration, once again, requires balance. As Jung moves deeper, he begins to see that religion is not merely a social institution, but a psychological necessity. The gods in the Red Book are not external beings demanding worship. They are inner forces that shape human experience. When a culture denies these forces, they do not disappear. They return in distorted forms, such as mass movements, fanaticism, or blind ideology. Jung realizes that the decline of traditional religion has left a vacuum that modern people fill unconsciously, often with destructive consequences. The psyche, he concludes, cannot live without symbols of meaning. One of the most unsettling insights Jung records is that suffering has purpose. The unconscious does not seek comfort or happiness in the modern sense. It seeks wholeness. Pain, loss, and confusion are not punishments, but signals of imbalance. Jung sees that avoiding suffering only postpones it, often making it worse. Through his visions, he learns that transformation is inseparable from sacrifice. Something old must die for something new to emerge. This death is not physical but psychological, the death of illusions, false identities, and rigid beliefs. Jung also confronts the collective dimension of the unconscious. His visions begin to reflect not only personal struggles, but historical and cultural crises. He senses approaching catastrophe, a collapse of old values that would engulf Europe. Though he does not predict events literally, his insights later seem eerily aligned with the psychological conditions that led to world wars. Jung understands that when individuals refuse to confront their shadows, those shadows accumulate at the collective level. What is denied inwardly eventually erupts outwardly. Despite the darkness of these revelations, Jung does not descend into despair. Instead, he discovers a strange form of hope, one rooted not in optimism, but in meaning. The unconscious, though brutal, is not nihilistic. It pushes toward integration, toward a deeper alignment between inner truth and outer life. Jung begins to sense the presence of the self, a central organizing principle of the psyche that transcends the ego. This self is not an idealized version of the personality, but a totality that includes all opposites. By the end of this phase, Jung realizes that individuation is not about perfection, but completeness. The goal is not to become good, pure, or enlightened, but to become whole. This wholeness demands courage, the courage to face inner darkness without being consumed by it, and to accept inner light without becoming inflated. The Red Book makes it clear that this path is lonely, misunderstood, and often painful. Yet it is the only path Jung believes leads to genuine meaning. This realization prepares Jung for the next stage of his journey, where the tension between ego and self intensifies, and the task of living these insights in the real world becomes unavoidable. As Jung moves further into his inner journey, the boundary between insight and responsibility becomes impossible to ignore. What once felt like visionary exploration now demands transformation in daily life. The unconscious no longer speaks only in symbols. It insists on action, on ethical reckoning, on lived change. Jung begins to understand that insight without integration is empty. To see truth but refuse to embody it is a subtle form of self-deception. The psyche does not forgive such avoidance. It responds with anxiety, restlessness, and fragmentation. Jung becomes increasingly aware of the ego's limitations. The ego, he realizes, is not the center of the psyche, but only a small island in a vast inner sea. Yet this island clings desperately to control, fearing dissolution. Jung does not seek to destroy the ego, but to place it in proper relation to the self. The self emerges as a regulating center that holds all opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, good and evil. Aligning with it requires surrender without annihilation, obedience without submission. This delicate balance becomes one of Jung's greatest struggles. Throughout his visions, Jung is repeatedly warned against imitation. No one else can follow his path exactly. Symbols that transform one person may poison another. This insight becomes foundational to his later psychology. Jung sees that modern people crave formulas, systems, and guarantees, but the soul refuses standardization. Individuation is radically personal. Meaning cannot be borrowed. Each person must encounter their own depths, their own symbols, their own demons. The task of life is not to follow a path, but to discover one. His encounters increasingly revolve around time and eternity. He experiences moments where past, present, and future seem to collapse into a single psychological reality. He understands that the unconscious does not experience time linearly. Ancient myths feel alive because they are alive, existing as timeless patterns within the psyche. This realization reshapes Jung's understanding of history. Humanity is not moving away from its past, but carrying it forward unconsciously. When ignored, this past returns in distorted forms. When acknowledged, it becomes wisdom. A powerful shift occurs as Jung recognizes the creative dimension of the psyche. The unconscious is not only destructive or corrective, it is also generative. It produces symbols, stories, images, and meanings that give life depth. Jung realizes that art, religion, and myth arise from the same inner source. Modern society's dismissal of these expressions has not eliminated the need for them. It has merely driven them underground. Jung sees creativity as a psychological necessity, a way for the unconscious to communicate and renew the individual. Yet creativity brings danger. Jung confronts the temptation to withdraw entirely into the inner world, to live among symbols rather than people. He recognizes this as another form of imbalance. The unconscious demands expression, but not escape. Jung repeatedly emphasizes the need to return to work, relationships, and responsibility. Without this return, inner exploration becomes narcissism. The measure of transformation is not the intensity of visions, but the quality of one's life afterward. The most profound insights in this phase is Jung's acceptance of uncertainty. He abandons the need for final answers. The psyche, he realizes, is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Certainty, once his intellectual refuge, now feels like a prison. Jung learns to tolerate ambiguity without despair. This tolerance becomes a form of wisdom. It allows life to remain alive, dynamic, and meaningful, rather than frozen into dogma. Jung also confronts the loneliness of individuation. As one moves away from collective norms, misunderstanding becomes inevitable. The individual who listens to the soul often appears strange, unproductive, or dangerous to society. Jung does not romanticize this isolation. He acknowledges its pain. Yet he also sees that conformity bought at the cost of inner truth leads to emptiness. The individual's task is not to reject society, but to stand in creative tension with it. As the visions mature, Jung senses that the unconscious is not opposed to consciousness, but seeks partnership. The goal is dialogue, not domination. When the ego listens without surrendering, and the unconscious speaks without overwhelming, a new psychological attitude emerges. Jung understands this as the birth of symbolic consciousness, a way of living that honors both rational clarity and mythic depth. This consciousness does not deny science or progress, but roots them in meaning. By the end of this stage, Jung recognizes that the Red Book is not a destination, but a beginning. The visions have not given him peace. They have given him responsibility. To live consciously means to remain open to inner truth without becoming enslaved by it. It means carrying the tension of opposites without collapsing into one side. Jung accepts that this task has no end point. Individuation is not a state, but a lifelong process. This realization prepares Jung for his final integration, where the insights of the unconscious must be reconciled with love, ethics, and service to the world, without losing their depth or power. As Jung reaches the final phase of his inner journey, the urgency of integration becomes absolute. The visions no longer seek interpretation alone. They demand embodiment. Jung understands that psychological truth means nothing if it remains locked in symbols. What has been revealed must now be lived. This realization marks the transition from inner exploration to ethical responsibility. The unconscious is not a refuge from the world, but a source of guidance for engaging it more honestly and fully. Jung comes to see love as the ultimate test of individuation. Not love as sentiment or attachment, but love as the capacity to relate without possession, to see another person as an autonomous reality rather than a projection of inner needs. He realizes that unresolved inner conflicts distort relationships, turning others into carriers of one's shadow or anima. Only by withdrawing these projections can genuine connection occur. This withdrawal is painful because it strips life of illusion, but it also returns power to the individual. One no longer demands that others complete what must be integrated within. Ethics emerge in the Red Book not as moral rules, but as inner responsibility. Jung understands that listening to the unconscious does not absolve one of accountability. On the contrary, it increases it. Inner images are not commands. They are invitations to reflection. Acting them out blindly leads to destruction. Jung insists that consciousness must judge, choose, and sometimes refuse the demands of the unconscious. True maturity lies in dialogue, not obedience. The individual becomes responsible not only for actions, but for inner attitudes. A crucial insight in this final movement is Jung's recognition of evil as a human reality that cannot be eradicated through denial. He rejects the fantasy of purity, the attempt to become only good, only light, only virtuous produces hypocrisy and repression. Jung sees that evil gains its greatest power when it is unconscious. By acknowledging darkness within, one reduces its compulsive force. This does not justify harmful behavior, but it grounds morality in self-knowledge rather than idealism. Responsibility replaces innocence. Jung also reflects deeply on death, not only physical death, but the many psychological deaths required throughout life. Each stage of growth demands the surrender of previous identities. The refusal to die psychologically leads to stagnation. Jung accepts impermanence as essential to meaning. Life, he realizes, gains depth not despite its finitude, but because of it. This acceptance dissolves the desperate clinging that characterizes the ego. In its place emerges a quieter, more grounded way of being. As the journey concludes, Jung becomes aware of the symbolic nature of the self more clearly than ever. The self is not an object to be grasped or an ideal to be achieved. It is a living center that reveals itself gradually through experience. Moments of alignment feel meaningful, ordered, and alive, while moments of disconnection feel empty and mechanical. Jung understands that these fluctuations are natural. Consciousness cannot permanently inhabit wholeness. The task is not permanence, but return. Jung's reflections expand outward toward humanity as a whole. He sees modern civilization as dangerously one-sided, obsessed with control, speed, and external achievement. Without inner balance, such progress becomes destructive. Jung does not propose a return to ancient religion or myth in literal form. Instead, he calls for a psychological renewal, a rediscovery of symbolic life that can coexist with rational thought. Without this renewal, individuals become fragmented, and societies become unstable. One of Jung's final insights is that meaning cannot be manufactured. It arises organically when life is lived in dialogue with the unconscious. This dialogue does not eliminate suffering, but it transforms it. Pain becomes purposeful rather than absurd. Conflicts become invitations rather than punishments. Jung understands that many people will reject this path, not because it is false, but because it is demanding. It requires courage, patience, and humility, qualities modern culture rarely rewards. The Red Book ultimately stands as a warning and an offering. It warns of the danger of living without inner awareness, of mistaking efficiency for wisdom and knowledge for meaning. At the same time, it offers a path, not a map, not a system, but a way of relating to the psyche that honors its depth and complexity. Jung does not present himself as a master, but as a witness to an inner reality shared by all who dare to look.